Good evening, everyone, and thank you for being with us. As you know, at 5x15, we love to bring you a variety of different stories. And this evening's fantastic lineup has variety in spades. We'll travel to prehistoric lands and to America's criminal underbelly, hear about the value of being unreasonable, and explore what makes us tick emotionally. We'll also hear about the history of women's football and the triumphant tale of England's Lionesses. Details about all of our speakers' books are posted in the chat, so please do check those out and grab yourselves copies of these brilliant titles. Without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker for this evening, Dean Burnett, a neuroscientist, blogger, sometime comedian, and author. His books, The Idiot Brain and The Happy Brain, were international bestsellers, and Dean's Guardian articles have been read over 16 million times. In his new book, Emotional Ignorance, Dean puts his own feelings under the microscope to ask where they come from, what purpose they serve, and why they make us feel the way they do. Dean, thank you for being with us. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen quickly. Okay, come on. Right, thank you all for tuning in and watching this. This talk is derived from my latest book, Emotional Ignorance. I'm talking about how emotions shape the way we perceive the world, because they did. And the origins of this book are quite, in-depth and personal to me. It was written during the lockdown and pandemic. My father contracted COVID in the very first weeks of the pandemic and passed away from it a month later. And I had to endure the emotional fallout from that in isolation. And obviously I had no outlets or outputs and ways to cope other than just writing about it. So this is me exploring my own emotional state, wondering why is this happening to me and therefore others, and why emotions do what they do, where they come from, why they exist as they do. Because emotions and science tend not to go together. But I turned out that's not a good thing, because they are very important and we should be more embracing of them and their influence over us, up to and including the fact that the way we actually perceive the world around us is heavily intertwined with emotions. It's not something we just ignore. They affect our very perception of reality via the senses in multiple ways. So one of the first things I remember encountering was the impact of smell on emotions and memory. My father wore a lot of aftershave. It was his thing. His favorite aftershave was the Jean Paul Gaultier brand, which I picture of there. I have a bottle of it upstairs in my house, and I cannot really wear it because every time I put it on, I'm reminded of him and of the experience I went through more vividly than any other time. And it's a well-known thing that smell is the sense which really evokes a strong emotional reaction, really triggers powerful emotional memories. And the reason for that, or the basis of this, to understand, you have to go back to the dawn of life on Earth, back in the primordial soup, as they call it. If you think about the very first life forms, they were basically just complex bags of chemicals in a complex chemical environment. Nothing but chemicals and chemicals interacting. And when life forms like that, what they need to know about is changes in the chemicals around them. And what is that if not smell? The sense, the ability to detect changes in the chemicals of your environment. The smell was the first sense to evolve. But of course, once you can sense something, you're taking in information, you need to be able to save the information or to do something with it. So smell led to sort of a deep connection with memory, the evolution of memory. But to be able to sense something and remember it, you need to also act on it and have some sort of response to it. And that's what emotions are, really, sort of instinctive reactions to things that happen to us. So smell, memory, and emotions evolved sort of in lockstep and dictated the very structure of our brains, which you can still see today. That's why this happens. So if you look at how the basic underlying system of the brain works, for many years, the memory system was believed to be part of the olfactory system, because the part of the brain which deals with smell and part of the brain which deals with memory and emotion are so close together, they look like the same thing in the early days of neuroscience. Now we know they're different, but what this does mean is that whereas other senses like sight and sound, although we may rely on them more, they are taken in via our eyes and ears, but they are shunted into the memory system via the thalamus, right in the center of the brain, which is like a hub for all information. Smell doesn't have that. Smell has a direct connection to the memory and emotion systems. It's like a VIP pass to an exclusive nightclub. It doesn't have to queue, it just goes straight in. And that's why smell has this power to trigger powerful emotional memories and very vivid ones, but also it sort of dictated the structure, the very structure of our brains and the way they evolved. So all of it's sort of the bedrock of that is smell and memory and emotions all linked together, and other senses sort of derived from that. So that's at the very start, emotions and senses were clearly influencing each other. Another thing me and my father sort of were different about was music, the ability of sound, certain types of sounds to have an emotional reaction. Now, he loved all sorts of different music. I have more weird tastes. Like I am a very rare Venga Boys apologist, as you can see from this photo here. And to me, they're not just a cheesy 90s dance band from Europe. They are, far more potent. I maintain that they are secret eco campaigners. I think the Venga bus is a metaphor for nuclear fusion because it's coming and everyone will be happy. When's it going to get you? No one knows. It's just coming. And also boom, 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 boom. I want you in my room. What is that? I'm going to call for abundant nuclear power, safe energy to power our homes. But that's by the by. But why do I really have this sort of weird obsession with late 90s cheesy dance band? Because I was a teenager at the time. I was in a very emotional state of mind. And that's when your memories the more lasting memories are formed. The emotions have this effect on the memory system. And that's where the music of our teens is usually the music we prefer for the rest of our life, because we have so much more strong emotional reactions to it. But it's not just that. I mean, the music affects us emotionally on multiple levels. There's the instinctive level, the fact that rapid rhythms can motivate us. That's why gym music is so up-tempo, something to do with relating to a heartbeat in the womb, perhaps. We hear the rhythm and we respond to it. Discordant noise or jagged sounds, very reminiscent of predator shrieks and growls and howls. And therefore we react negatively to that, have a negative emotional reaction at a very fundamental level. But at the more complex levels, like when we hear music when we're in an emotional state, that music we associate with that emotion. And therefore that music becomes, or has the ability to invoke that emotion in us. And if we can understand music on a complex cognitive level, like we can see the patterns and the rhythms of it, being able to decipher that and predict it does make us, it triggers a positive emotional reaction. So music affects us emotionally in multiple ways, but it also helps us in a strange roundabout way. And I found that out whilst trying to process my own. Lots of music, like heavy metal, is designed to make you angry. And there's lots of sad music. And objectively, that's weird, because these are emotions we don't like. We would try to avoid becoming angry or becoming sad. They are negative emotions. But then music which triggers these emotions is very popular. What happens is that it's sort of like, you have to accept that these negative emotions, although we try to avoid them, they are fundamentally useful, necessary for our brains to function and to maintain good well-being. Our brain has this full suite of emotional capabilities. And by only using or embracing one aspect of all that, we can become unhealthy or mentally unhealthy. But of course, it causes a bit of a problem because we need to experience negative emotions to make sure our brains capable of dealing with these things, because the way our brains work, the part of the brain which is responsible for producing emotion is also the part responsible for processing it, for integrating the experience into our mental state and sort of a mental model of how the world works. So you can't process an emotion if you don't experience it. So therefore we have to experience negative emotions in order to work through them and get used to them, which is unhelpful because we try to avoid experiences which trigger these emotions. That's where music and other art forms that trigger these emotions come in, because they allow us to experience that certain sort of emotion in a safe, risk-free way. So when you listen to a sad song, it's not you haven't got to go through any particular trauma yourself to experience sadness. You are experiencing it vicariously. Heavy metal music, it's not something making you angry. It is the angry music which is triggering that emotion in yourself. And this gives our brain essentially a workout. It allows our brain to activate those emotional processes which are necessary for maintaining good well-being. And our brain sort of recognizes this. It goes, oh, good, now I've experienced this emotion, and I am better able to handle my own sadness or anger, and therefore going forward, you're in a better place. You're more capable of dealing with these emotions. As many studies have shown, people who are fans of heavy metal tend to be the least angry people, because their brains are always being worked out, and their ability to process and handle anger is better than the average person's because they have more experience of that. Same with sadness. So embracing negative emotions via art forms is, like music, is a very helpful thing. And color of emotions, a lot of emotions have a color associated with them. When we say things like red with anger, or green with envy, but also it's hard to deny that despite them just being photons of different wavelengths hitting our retinas, colors do have a certain emotional quality for us humans. Like red is often associated with danger. That's why stop signs are always red. They make us alert, we're attracted to them. Whereas greens and blues are quite calming. Hence you have medical smocks and outfits, uniforms that are always that sort of color. You never get a hospital worker covered in red unless the surgery has gone spectacularly badly. And clashing colors can be quite unpleasant to look at, as the example I put down there. They are, they shouldn't be. It's just just different wavelengths of light, but they trigger an emotional response in us, and therefore colors and emotions do seem to have a fundamental neurological link. But if you look into the actual science of it, it goes even deeper than that. That it's not just that certain emotions are linked to certain colors. It seems to be, according to some evidence, that emotions are the reasons we can see colors at all. And to understand that, you have to look at the fact that primates, including humans, all have bald faces, which is not the norm in the mammal kingdom. Most hairy mammals have hair covering their entire body. Why would primates be the exception to this? Because primates, and particularly humans, are very good at communicating their emotions. We have the most elaborate facial expressions to do this. The primary source of emotional information from other species mates is the face in primates. But you don't need a bald face for that, because obviously the facial features can move around. You can see that fine. But what happens when you have no hair in your face is that you can see the color change in the skin of the face when an emotional response happens. Like I said, when someone turns a bit green, it suggests they're disgusted or unwell. If they turn red, they are aroused, which could be anger, excitement, or anything like that. If they are, their face goes white, they are afraid of something because the blood has been shunted elsewhere for the fight or flight response. And that information is apparently very useful, because not just the facial expressions, the color we've evolved to recognize in our species mates' faces when emotions trigger a certain color change when they're undergoing an emotional state. And human color vision is particularly sensitive to a certain range of colors. And that range appears to correspond almost exactly with the range of colors that manifests in the skin of our face when we are experiencing a certain range of emotions. So basically our eyesight, our ability to see color, evolved to better recognize the colors of someone's face when they are experiencing a certain emotion. So the ability to detect emotions was the thing that drove the evolution of our perception of color. Therefore, emotions are the reason we can see the colors we do. And therefore, colors and emotions have a deep, 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 very fundamental link. And that's just three very profound ways in which emotions have affected and dictated the way we actually perceive the world and the very structure of our brains. So ignoring them or suppressing them is probably not the best approach. So as I say, that's all. You can read all that in the book, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dean. Our next speaker is Patrick Radden Keefe, an award-winning staff writer at The New Yorker and author of the international bestsellers Empire of Pain, which won the Baillie Gifford Prize for Nonfiction, Say Nothing, winner of the Orwell Prize, and most recently, Rogues. Patrick's latest book to appear here in the UK, The Snakehead, was first published in 2009. It's a sweeping history of the American dream, of Manhattan's Chinatown underbelly, and the mastermind behind one of the largest human smuggling rings. We are delighted to have Patrick with us this evening, and tonight he'll be in conversation with Rosie Boycott. Rosie, Patrick, thank you. Over to you.
Hi, good evening and welcome here. And I couldn't be more happy than to have well, unfortunately, not very long to talk to Patrick, who has been on 5 by 15 before, talking about his amazing book about the opium epidemic. But Patrick, I know Jack just said this book was published in 2009, but I mean, actually, it's so current, everything you write about. Let's dive right into, in a way, how you dive into the book. And that was about an event that happened on June the 6th, 1993 in Rockaway, when a particular boat called the Golden Venture crashed ashore one dark night.
Yeah, it was. I should say, first of all, Rosie, it's lovely to be with you. I'm so glad to have the chance to chat. Thank you all for joining us. Um, 30 years ago, this summer, 30 years ago, June 6th, a tramp steamer, a kind of dilapidated ship, ran aground off the shore in Queens, New York. So if you've ever flown into LaGuardia or JFK in New York, right near there. And it was very cold. And all of these people started coming up out of the hold and jumping off the ship and into the surf. And there were 290 people on board. They had come all the way from Fujian province in southeast China. And they'd actually not done it the kind of straightforward way. They'd gone the wrong way around the world. So it was a 17,000-mile journey. It took them 120 days, which, to give you a sense of context, when the Mayflower came to Plymouth in 1620, it took 60 days. And this journey took 120.
And they were all paying a vast amount of money.
Yes. So there at that time were a lot of people who were wanting to leave China. And I should say not China broadly so much as this one region, Fujian province. And there was this huge surge of people trying to get out and get to the United States. And they weren't able to legally do so. And so they would pay human smugglers, which in Chinese, these people were referred to as snakeheads, to get them out of China and around the world to the United States. This was not human trafficking. They were going of their own free will. They knew that it would be risky, and they were committing at that time to pay $35,000 a person to get smuggled in this fashion.
So that boatload was worth one hell of a lot of money.
It was indeed. It was a very, very lucrative business. And there were all kinds of people who went into this business, many of them unscrupulous gangsters. And then in particular, there was this woman who was at the center of my book, this woman whose name was Cheng Chui Ping, but was known in the neighborhood as Sister Ping. Everybody knew her as Sister Ping. And she was not just a snakehead, but the best, the most famous of the snakeheads. And she was one of the snakeheads behind this voyage of this ship, which was called the Golden Venture, which ran aground in 93.
And Sister Ping herself began in Fujian province. What was her story? How did she find herself as this chief snakehead?
So interestingly, she was the daughter of a snakehead. Her father had come to the United States himself much earlier. He had jumped ship, which is what people would do at that time. You have to remember that because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, and really, the better part of a century in which the United States created all kinds of restrictions preventing people coming from China to the US. And then, of course, in China, once communism took hold, people didn't have the legal right to leave. And so you had a sort of frozen situation. Her father came in an earlier generation when it was very difficult to come to the United States, but he was involved in the trade of smuggling people. And so she kind of grew up in a smuggling family. She was very entrepreneurial. She grew up against the backdrop of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. And as soon as she could, she got as far as Hong Kong and went into business in Hong Kong, starting a whole series of, she had a shop, she had all kinds of, an arcade, she had different types of businesses that she ran. And eventually she came to the United States legally, in her case, in the early 1980s. And she settled in Chinatown in New York City. She had a husband who was kind of a hapless figure, in some ways a much less impressive person who was kind of riding her coattails. But they settled in New York City, and almost immediately she started sending for people from her home village back in China and illegally smuggling them into the US.
So she had just getting them out of China itself was quite difficult. I mean, how did she do it? Because not everybody ended up on the Golden Venture going 17,000 miles, did they?
No, initially it was really done chiefly with planes. They would use phony documents. and get people on planes. Sometimes they would do that out of Hong Kong. It was very often the case that people would cross the mountains of Burma, get into Thailand, and then they would fly out of Bangkok airport. And eventually there were so many people leaving in this way that the authorities cracked down and started really scrutinizing the phony documents. And it was at that point, this is sort of late 80s, early 90s, particularly after Tiananmen Square, when you had a lot of people wanting to leave, and also a perception that in the United States there would be sympathy for people fleeing China who could get as far as the US. You had this great surge of demand, and it was at that point that they started putting people in the holds of ships.
But if you came by plane, you didn't necessarily land yourself in America, did you? I mean, there were a lot of Central American countries that became absolutely crucial to the passage of the snakeheads.
Yeah, I mean, this is part of what I find so fascinating about Sister Ping. On the one hand, she was this criminal mastermind, and I don't think I'm giving too much away to say that, this story ends with a big international manhunt, and she ends up in prison for the rest of her life. But on the other hand, she was an incredibly adept businesswoman, and so she ended up with these networks that stretch from Canada to the Caribbean to Guatemala to Mexico. At a certain point, one of her ships only gets as far as Kenya, and it's sort of out of commission in Kenya. And she arranges for some of her passengers to go down to South Africa, where she owns an ostrich farm, to bide their time until she can get them on another ship. It was truly a business of a globalized order.
So what's also very fascinating that you bring out in the book is that while obviously the American authorities think that Sister Ping is the arch criminal of all times, to the Chinese, to the people in Fujian who are desperate to leave, she is also the mother who helps them complete their wishes. And you mentioned that thing that she made the effort to look after those people and they got them to South Africa. She's quite responsible for everybody who she agrees to take, isn't she?
I mean, she is, with the caveat that some of them die.
Yeah, but she does warn them.
Yeah, exactly. No, I mean, they go into it knowing the risks. And this was actually, I'm glad you asked about this, because this was, for me, what started me on this project in the first place. It was actually the first piece I ever published in the New Yorker, was the piece that grew into this book. And when I learned about Sister Ping, what I learned that really struck me was that the federal government in the United States was saying, here's this woman who ran this criminal enterprise, and she's a terrible person, and people died along the way, and she took all this money, and she should go away to prison for life. And in Chinatown, she was revered as a living Buddha. She was this figure who was perceived as having been instrumental in helping thousands of people leave one life and build a new one. And that kind of paradox, the idea that she could be seen in those two very different lights in these two different communities, was part of what I found so magnetic about her.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I did too. And one of the other things that really intrigued me about your book was the sense that in terms of the way America and immigration generally goes, there are fashions in immigration. I mean, here in the UK, it has been very fashionable to have Ukrainian refugees, whereas the summer before, when there were just as many Syrians, somehow that never became fashionable or politically okay. And that you see that in terms of, like you mentioned, Tiananmen. After Tiananmen, it was a little easier to get yourself to America.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. And it's interesting if you look at the sort of the history of American immigration policy. I mean, we're dealing with this now as well, because there are all these jobs. I mean, people who pick strawberries for a living, right? People who work in slaughterhouses, where you actually do want a steady supply of people who will take these very thankless jobs. And so there's often a kind of economic demand for these people. And yet the culture tends to shift very quickly in terms of when it will accept these people and won't. And you're quite right. I mean, one of the fascinating details in this story is that you had some people who were fleeing the one-child policy in China. And so they would get as far as the US and say, listen, they were going to force me to have an abortion, or they were going to sterilize me because we wanted to have multiple children. And interestingly enough, Republicans in the US traditionally are pretty anti-immigrant, or certainly less pro-immigrant than the Democratic Party would be in the caricature. But in this case, because there was such a strong pro-life sentiment and anti-abortion sentiment among the Republicans, there was a sense that, well, if they're fleeing forced abortions, then we should embrace these people and let them in and give them asylum.
Yes, you have a fascinating bit where Chinese person after Chinese person all claims that if they get sent home, they're going to be sterilized. and therefore they get given asylum. But as I said at the beginning, I mean, your book is incredibly topical. I mean, when you get towards the end of it, and I know it's a decade ago, but you're talking about how many millions of people are somewhere in the world attempting to get somewhere else, many of them aided by the many sister pings that we have around the world. When you were writing it, were you very aware of all the other groups? You talk about some Sikhs in Guatemala and just groups that are desperate to move.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's impossible not to. I was sort of closely focused on this one story. And of course, when I was writing it, the fortunes had changed in China, right? People were not desperate to get out of China because it actually seemed as though they could stay right where they were and make a fortune. But it's interesting to realize that as recently as the 1990s, they were taking these incredible risks to get out. And of course, today, I mean, you know, you have these terrible stories of people coming up through South America and Central America, through Mexico to get into the U.S. You've got people coming from North Africa, right, trying to get as far as Lampedusa off the coast of Italy. You've got ships sinking. You've got refugees, you know, coming out of Syria and various other countries. So yeah, I mean, to me, the idea of these great flows of millions and millions of people who are kind of uprooted and trying to find a better place around the world, and often undertaking these serious risks in doing so, that feels to me more urgent now as an issue than ever.
And would you find the snakeheads similar types of level of organization replicated in people fleeing South America, people fleeing parts of Africa? Would it be as complex and as amazing as what Sister Ping did?
I don't know that it would necessarily be quite so sophisticated. Yes, you do have these kinds of brokers in all kinds of different parts of the world, moving people from point A to point B. Part of what was so intriguing to me about Sister Ping and her empire was just the sheer level of sophistication, the multiplicity of routes that she would take, and the numbers of people. I mean, thousands of people who she moved from China into the US.
Do you have, we're coming up to time, I'm sorry, I could go on for ages, but do you have an idea how many people she managed to move in her active career?
I don't know. I think, I mean, thousands is an estimate, but I think that's a pretty grounded estimate. I will tell you that she eventually died. She died in a federal prison in Texas in 2014. This is after the book was published in the States. And I went to her funeral in Chinatown, and there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people out on the streets. It was, you know, it was a local hero was being buried. There was not a sense that this was a criminal who died in federal prison. It was a day of great mourning in the community.
Yeah, she is a completely brilliant character to read about, to anyone out there who hasn't read this book. I read it in one go, and it's completely captivating because she is so complicated. I mean, quite frankly, she could run General Motors or be president. I mean, her level, down to the tiniest details to the biggest picture, she seemed to be able to do it all.
Indeed, yeah.
Well, thank you, Patrick, very much for joining us, and thank you for I'm so glad this book has now been published, and great to see you again. And I'm now going to hand back to Jack. Good night.
Thank you so much, Patrick, and thank you, Rosie. Our next speaker this evening is Kirsty Sedgman, an award-winning cultural studies scholar based at the University of Bristol. Kirsty publishes and speaks on art, media, participation, and cultural sociology, and she's the author of numerous academic publications, including 2 monographs and an edited collection on theatre fandom. In her new book on being unreasonable, Kirsty argues that sometimes we need to act unreasonably to bring about positive change. We can't wait to hear about why. Kirsty, thank you. Over to you.
Thank you so much for having me. So over the past decade or so, I've become obsessed with one big question, and that is, what does it mean to feel like you are a reasonable person with the right to tell other people how they should behave? So this all started when I had my first baby, Monty. Whether it was checking my email while the kids were playing in the park or trying to stop them crying desperately on a bus, my experiences of being a parent have largely been coloured by the knowledge that at any time I'm probably being watched and judged by strangers who all seem to think that they know what's best. And it started immediately. So Monty was born in, I'm going to get this right, in August 2014. And despite a lot of support from the great midwives, I was finding feeding him really challenging. So I think he was just a couple months old. And I was still in the stage where it really felt like someone was holding a lit match to my nipples. And then breastfeeding spread all over the news in the UK. And that was because a mother sitting in a restaurant feeding her child had been told to cover up with a tablecloth. But that only really went viral when Nigel Farage, who was then the leader of UKIP, waded into the debate. And he said, on a radio interview, he said, "It's not too hard, surely, to breastfeed discreetly." And then the internet erupted. So on the one side, the arguments went, it's the legal right of feeding parents not to be made to feel uncomfortable when they're giving their children the necessary nourishment for them to stay alive. But on the other, the opposite side of the argument said that it's my fellow citizens' right to expect that people like me who are feeding our children in public should take reasonable measures not to inflict our breasts onto others and make them feel uncomfortable. It's just about manners, consideration, common sense. And watching that online backlash unfold, what I realized is that everyone had a really different idea about what it means to be reasonably discreet. Does it mean facing the wall? Does it mean slinking away to the loo? Does it mean getting out only one boob at a time rather than whopping out both simultaneously? And how can anyone confidently really advise on what a reasonable level of discretion actually looks like if they don't have any understanding of my personal circumstances or how hard and how painful it was, how it needed me to sit totally still for an hour sometimes so that things didn't slip and cause agony, and in many cases without the commenter perhaps having even that experience of owning a pair of breasts. And yet, just be reasonable, people kept saying. Why is that so hard? And then I began noticing that word reasonable everywhere. And what I realized is that what seems reasonable to one person is to another person totally rude. So I started a research project to study that reasonableness in action. My specialism is theatre audiences. So whether it's watching a Brecht play or watching a political phenomenon like the Brexit referendum, I am endlessly fascinated by how we can watch the same event unfolding but come to such completely different understandings about what it means. And around that same time, as part of my day job, I've been getting really interested in the post-millennial rise of a specific term. That term was theatre etiquette. So what I noticed was around the world, all these opinion pieces and articles, they kept popping up using that term. And the general vibe was that audiences in theatres are getting increasingly badly behaved. They don't know how to behave when they're in the theatre or in the cinema anymore. So we need to retrain them in what it means to be polite. So for example, on Broadway, there was a famous case where a drunk person climbed up on stage and plugged their phone into a fake socket on the set. In the West End in London, someone else apparently used the interval to run out and grab a KFC bargain bucket, but also just an absolute swarm of complaints about people using phones and drinking and chatting and singing along, things like that. So I did a deep dive into those ideas of manners and consideration and common sense, using theatre etiquette as a case study. And I found that none of this is actually as simple as it seems, because manners, historically, I found have often been used, well, they're used to make shared social life better and cleaner and safer for everyone. Manners are often a really good thing, of course. But sometimes they've also been wielded as a weapon used to disempower and divide us. So, for example, rules like wash your hands before eating foods. I mean, I think most people can agree that that's a self-evidently good thing. But think about other rules like which set of cutlery should I use first at a posh dinner? That's all about figuring out who belongs at the table and who doesn't. So that was my first foray really into understanding how common sense can be uncommon in ways that we don't necessarily understand. And it's the same in theatre, I found. So rules like don't use a mobile because it's disrespectful or distracting to performers, or wait until the interval before you go to the loo. Those things often seem like common sense. It's just about consideration for other people. But we also need to consider that others might have other needs. Like, for example, the woman quite recently who got really upset because she needed to glance discreetly at her phone. She was using it as a disability aid and she was publicly shamed. Or our inability to know whether the people ambling past us down the aisle has had too many pints or might have a condition that makes them need the loo more often, for example. So I wrote a big academic analysis of these theatre etiquette debates. And I thought I was done. I thought I'd said everything I needed to say. But then COVID hit and I realized that I had so much more that I wanted to investigate here, because what I found was that those reasonable judgments were extending into every aspect of social life. So questions like, should we wear masks? And if so, in what situations? Those are still rumbling on today. Or is it okay to apply makeup on public transport, or is that a rude thing to do? Should kids be banned from restaurants? And if so, which ones? And those little arguments, I think, expose much deeper, bigger fractures, like our views on whether or not we should have a monarchy and how they should act, or on acts of public protest, or neighborhood behavior policing on apps like Nextdoor, for example. And so I wrote a whole new book, which was on being unreasonable, which Stephanie's kindly popped in the chat. And this traces the emergence of a philosophical concept called the reasonable man standard, which from about the 1800s onwards, that became embedded in every aspect of the international legal system. It was used to judge everything from reasonable accommodations in disability law to reasonable use of force in cases of police brutality, to reasonable conduct in complaints about sexual harassment. And that reasonable man standard, which evolved into the reasonable person test, that has also become embedded, I think, in every aspect of social life itself. That's what I track in the book. It's become part of those respectability politics narratives about the need to control and repress and restrain every aspect of our lives, our minds, our bodies, our emotions, and our lived environment itself, in a way that I think, and I argue, is destroying our sense of community and spoiling the natural world that we live in. Okay, but in law, as in life, of course, we need a way to draw those reasonable lines. We need a way to separate, a mechanism for separating good from bad, appropriate from inappropriate, acceptable from unacceptable, moral from immoral, lawful from unlawful. Of course, we need a way to draw those lines. But what I argue, and what all this research has told me, is that we also need to think really carefully and critically about who overwhelmingly has had the power to draw those lines and to make those rules. Who do they benefit, and who disproportionately do they harm? So the big question now that my book on being unreasonable asks is, in a world where we all think we're being reasonable, how can we really figure out what's right? How can we have those debates? How can we ask and answer those questions as a collective in a way that supports and uplifts everyone? And also in cases of great injustice, whether it's the climate crisis or racial discrimination or violence against women, in cases where being reasonable and calm and engaging in endless civil debate hasn't fixed things, then maybe in those cases, maybe we need to give ourselves and others permission to be unreasonable where necessary to make the world a better place, even if that means breaking the rules.
Kirsty, thank you so much for that. Our fourth speaker this evening is the paleobiologist and author Thomas Halliday. Thomas is an associate research fellow at the Department of Earth Sciences at the University of Birmingham, and his PhD won the Linnean Society Medal for Best Thesis in the Biological Sciences in the UK. Thomas's highly acclaimed book, Other Lands, was a Sunday Times bestseller, a Foyle's Book of the Year 2022, and it was longlisted for the Baillie Gifford Prize for Nonfiction. Thomas, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me. So it's a remarkable fact, really, that the world has not always been the way it is today, not just in human terms, which as a paleobiologist sort of sees the trivial topsoil on top of the rest of life's wonders, but also in the environments around us. But from the human perspective, these changes are often really hard to notice, right? We sort of fix as normal, even in historical terms, the environments of our youth. And historically, there's been very little reason really to suggest that things have not always been so. Now, I grew up in Wrack in the Highlands, and of course there the native ecosystem is this temperate rainforest, of which the Blackwood of Wrack is one of the very few surviving fragments that has not been replaced by either so repeatedly burnt heather to support shooting populations of grouse or pine monocultures for timber. But of course, even that landscape, that temperate rainforest, is a relatively young phenomenon. Only about 12,000 years ago, Wrack was buried under ice sheets that were kilometers deep, right? These are environments which are as much a product of the time in which they happen to exist as the land on which they grow. Now, the first person to recognize that climates could change, that environments were not always constant, lived longer ago than you might expect. You have to go back almost 1,000 years to a man called Shen Kuo, who was a civil servant, administrator, polymath in the Song dynasty of China. He was a very smart man. He was part of the reformist group of politicians at the time. He was an engineer. He invented the magnetic compass and was the first person to recognize that true north and magnetic north were different from one another and how to change that. He also had his role as an administrator and a surveyor. And in 1080, he was surveying the results of a landslip in Yanshou in northern China when he noticed exposed by this landslip was this unmistakable open space underground where there was bamboo, petrified seemingly and turned to stone. And this puzzled him, right? Because in Yanshou is quite far north, it's generally too cool and too arid for bamboo to grow. And in all the historical records he looked at, he could find no evidence that bamboo had ever grown there. And so he proposed that the climates must have changed, and that at some point in the past, he didn't know whether it was a historical time which was absent from the records or sometime prehistoric, which he did speculate on, that the climate of the landscape had been more suited to bamboo. Climates changed. Now, in the intervening 1,000 years, we have, of course, learned a whole lot more about how landscapes and environments can change over time, and how the presence of a landscape today is not necessarily indicative that it has always been so. One of the things that I want to explore in Other Lands is this idea of these ecosystems that are lost, these worlds that Earth has at one time supported, but no longer does. And so over the course of 16 chapters, I visit 16 sites which are extraordinary, either in what ecological lessons they can teach us or in environments that no longer exist, or creatures that are very bizarre by the standards of our own sort of arbitrary present day. at the time they existed, of course, all of these landscapes were fully fledged, vibrant, living places, as much as any temperate rainforest or steppe grassland is today. And in fact, grassland is perhaps a good jumping off point. Grasses are ubiquitous today, right? Grasslands are the most common ecosystem on the planet in the present day. And yet they only really became a landscape forming plant about 35 million years ago, with the end of the Eocene period, the epoch, I should say. Grasses were not even present on Earth until approximately 100 million years ago in the Cretaceous period, which means that dinosaurs like Stegosaurus, like Diplodocus that lived in the Jurassic would never have encountered a grass at all, and indeed would never have encountered a flower. Flowering plants, although the most common type of plant that exists today, arrived on Earth about 125 million years ago, at the beginning of the Cretaceous period, diversifying in what is sort of termed as the Cretaceous angiosperm revolution. At about the same time as insects which pollinate them also became extremely diverse. But these grasslands themselves only became widespread at a point of dramatic climate change, right? For most of the Cretaceous, for most of the Paleocene, most of the Eocene, the Earth was a very warm place. There was no ice permanently at the poles in what is termed a greenhouse world. In place in Antarctica, Antarctica was covered by a lush temperate rainforest, very similar to that which you can find today in Wrack, and indeed in places like Chile and in British Columbia in Canada. And in parts of Western Europe, like Ireland, and as I say, like in the Western Isles of Scotland. This rainforest supported an environment which is preserved really only in fragments on the southern fringes of the other southern continents in the Valdivian rainforest of Chile and in parts of New Zealand and so on, which are dominated by Araucarian monkey puzzles, by Nothofagus, which is the southern beech, a relative of our beech trees. This greenhouse world changed, and it changed as a result of a combination of factors. One was that India was rapidly piling into Asia at that time, raising the Himalayas and exposing a lot of silicate rock. When you expose silicate rock, carbon dioxide gets absorbed, and that removes it from the atmosphere, which causes temperatures to generally drop. And the second factor is that South America and Antarctica became separated from one another. And when that happened, an oceanic current was able to be opened up, which still to this day circles Antarctica continually without colliding into any other landmass. And because it has this continual cycling nature, the atmosphere above it is also sort of locked off from the rest of the atmosphere. Antarctica became this isolated system that was no longer being warmed by warm water currents and warm air currents from the north, from the equator. And so Antarctica began to glaciate. The ice sheets spread out from the high Antarctic mountains and eventually pushed out any trace of complex ecosystems and large plants, large animals from that continent, until the only permanent inhabitants of that continent today are a few small plants, a little moss, a little liverwort, and the emperor penguin, which doggedly holds on as the last survivor of that sort of great transantarctic rainforest. And when the earth cooled, the opportunity came for grass. Grass is a plant which is very well adapted to that sort of middle of the road climate, where it's a little bit too dry to support a fully fledged forest, but not so dry that you can't have extremely productive landscapes. They like middling temperatures. They don't like it to be too hot, too cold. And so grasslands are very, very well adapted to the icehouse world, which has only existed for about 35 million years. And so we really should look at the world around us not as, something that is necessary and intrinsic to the functioning of life, but something which is purely necessary and intrinsic to the functioning of life right now. And as a species which has evolved in the last couple of million years and which exists right now, we should be very careful to make sure that we do maintain the global environments in which we have evolved and in which we continue to live. When I talk about, when people talk about life persisting after any mass extinction, of which there have been several in the past, and of course life has persisted, it is why we're here, we should never take that as a reason for inaction, a reason for sitting back and think, well, it'll all be all right in the end. After mass extinction, everything always changes. The world always reasserts itself in a new and unusual way that has never been seen before, many of which are marvelous and wonderful. But we should also remember that the particular ways of life can be extremely fragile. The grassland that existed 20,000 years ago when Wrack was covered in kilometers of ice, one of those grasslands was called the Mammoth Steppe. It stretched all the way from the Iberian Peninsula in the west through Europe, through what is now Russia, across a dry land, what is now the bottom of the Bering Straits, into Alaska, into Canada, as the largest continuous ecosystem that has ever existed on this planet. Within a few thousand years, it had disappeared more or less entirely, restricted now only to a few patches of analogous environments in what is now Mongolia. That change was brought about by a runaway transformation as moisture broke in to this enclosed courtyard-like space hidden by the Himalayas and other mountain ranges, hidden by ice sheets, as moisture managed to find a way in and turn that grassland into peat irreversibly. The biggest environment in the world vanished over the course of a very short time. We are at a point now when the changes that we are effecting to the climate, to the atmosphere, have the potential to have a similar runaway effect. But we are at that point of choosing that future. We have the technology, we have the political means, and we have the examples to follow, like the Montreal Protocol, for example, to avert this catastrophe, and all it takes is coming together. I want to end with another sort of old climatologist, not quite as old as Shen Kuo. This time in 1856, a paper by an American woman called Eunice Newton Foote was published. She was interested in how it could be that the coal swamps that are seen in the fossil record are found in places which today could not support such tropical swamps. This is before an understanding, of course, of plate tectonics. But one of her hypotheses are these coal swamps, which are found in everywhere from Illinois to the Midlands of the UK to Westphalia in Germany, were in a world where carbon dioxide was higher. That is how coal could be laid down in the first place. And she wondered what effect that would have on the climate, what effect that would have on the environmental temperature. So she filled glass cylinders with air, she filled them with hydrogen, she filled them with carbon dioxide, and she exposed them to sunlight, and she put them in direct sun, she put them in the shade. But the results that she found were unmistakable. Carbon dioxide filled cylinders in the sun quickly reached the temperature of 52 degrees Celsius, 125 Fahrenheit, as she reported it, compared with only 104 degrees Fahrenheit, 40 degrees Celsius in the cylinder of air. And she reported that with respect to carbon dioxide, an atmosphere of that gas would give to our Earth a high temperature. And as, if some suppose, at one period of its history, the air had mixed with it a larger proportion than at present, an increased temperature from its own action, as well as from increased weight, must have necessarily resulted. Now, I mention this story because this is in 1856. 3 years later, in 1859, 3 years after we had learned about the greenhouse properties of carbon dioxide, the first commercial oil well was sunk in the USA, in Cherry Tree, Pennsylvania. At the time, it wasn't thought that we could release enough carbon dioxide to cause that, cause those changes to occur once again in our lifetimes, or indeed, within a couple of centuries. But we have now demonstrably shown that that is not the case, and we are changing that. So it is up to us, I think, to reflect on this and to realize what changes we are putting on our planet, and to think about the worlds of the past that are lost and to avoid ours becoming one of them. Thank you very much for listening.
Thomas, thank you so much for that. Our final speaker this evening is Suzanne Wrack, the Guardian and Observer's women's football correspondent, and the first person to hold this title at a national newspaper. In her book, A Woman's Game, Suzanne explores the history of women's football from the Victorian era, when players wore high-heeled boots, to the victories of the present day. We're so looking forward to hearing about this. Suzanne, thank you and welcome.
Hi all, thanks. I'm just going to share my screen with you because I've put together a few slides just to bring women's football to life a little bit for you. So, 2 seconds. Oh. Hang on. So, this is my book, A Women's Game, and I think it's particularly pertinent to be talking about women's football so soon after the Euros, which I'm sure many of you could not avoid in the summer, which is a little bit of a shift change for the women's game. It's not used to necessarily having as many eyes and ears on it as it did during the summer's tournament. This is the original cover of my book on the left and the new cover of my book on the right, which is yet to be released following the success of the Euros. And it's, I suppose, the choice of image speaks to the sort of revolution that has happened in women's football in England in recent years. The image on the left is of Brandi Chastain celebrating the US women's team winning the World Cup in 1999, which was really a game-changing tournament for women's football in the United States. And then Chloe Kelly similarly replicating that celebration inadvertently, unconsciously, as England won the Euros, was pretty symbolic of the kind of shift change we're seeing in England at the moment. So I wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of a sort of brief history of women's football in a nutshell, to give you a little bit of a flavour of what's in the book. So the very first examples of women's football, I think a lot of people know, if they know about football generally, will be aware that the very, very first forms of people kicking balls was in China in sort of around the sort of Han Dynasty. But what many people don't know is actually women playing football was also prevalent at that time. There's a game called Cujo, called kickball. And some of these images that you can see there suggest that women also played the sport. There's very, very few bits of evidence to kind of really be able to say definitively that it was a sport that was played, kind of on teams in the same way that there is archival evidence that the men's game was and stuff, but there is enough evidence to suggest that women were also involved in playing sport as early as that, which is quite exciting because obviously women's football is very much treated as a bit of a new phenomenon. So the late 1800s was the first example of women's football kind of getting a little bit of a foothold in England. There was initially, before some of these pictures, there was the first attempt of the first recorded football match between two women's teams was a game in Scotland in 1888, between an England team and a Scotland team that was made up of women theatre players by a theatre entrepreneur who saw the growth of men's international football and thought this could be a unique way of jumping on that bandwagon. Shortly after that, in 1884, a woman called Nettie Honeyball, which was a pseudonym, she's the woman on the top left, who was a bit of an aristocrat, launched the British Ladies Football Club, put an advert in the newspaper calling for players to come and join the team, and essentially founded a British women's football team that would compete against a team in Scotland, which was run by a woman called Mrs. Graham, another pseudonym. At that time, it was very much a political move. Nettie Honeyball and the team's patron, Lady Dixie, were like staunch feminists, had campaigned for gender neutral clothing and things like that. And they saw football as a tool to progress sort of suffrage and feminist ideas at the time. So they, saw this hugely popular sport and thought, this is a way to reach the masses and bring people towards those ideas on a much greater scale, to challenge some of the ideas of what women should be and do at the time, and push back against them. So that was the very, very first examples. They play games up and down the country. They got some pretty horrific press, games physically attacked, police having to sort of break up crowds on horseback, that kind of thing. This was some of the examples of sort of the coverage of women playing at that time. This was in the Sketch magazine, real sort of mocking take of women playing football. So you've got top right, the poor referee, this like sort of crowd of women swarming this poor referee in their lovely shirts. You've got a woman arriving at the match in her full gear, cane in hand, handbag at the ready. The women reading the newspapers afterwards, a very glamorous referee standing in goal, them kind of fanning themselves and doing their hair at half time and stuff, and very, very like sort of piss-taking, mocking of the idea of women being involved in football at the time. And that very much corresponded to what was taking place in society in general at that time. Women in the Victorian era were supposed to be delicate and elegant and pale, and not kind of be out in the sun fighting players on a pitch, but it's kind of sitting at a piano and reading a book and that kind of thing. So it was very much a kind of correlation between the attitudes towards women and the attitudes towards women playing sport. But in the sort of from about 1917 to the sort of mid 1920s, that shifted quite dramatically. The First World War had a huge impact on the growth of women's football, because with men going off to fight in the war, the factories were filled with women workers to fill the gap left behind by them. And very, very much in the same way that a lot of men's football teams were born out of the factories, so were a lot of women's teams. So it was less frowned upon for women to play football, because it was seen as like advantageous to have a fit and healthy workforce, to give them something to do, to keep them occupied and morale up and things like that. Football was suddenly a good thing for women to do at the time. So you had all these factory teams sort of spring up all across the country and really change the way people looked at women playing football. This is the most famous team of the time, Dick Kerr Ladies, who in 1953 in 1920 attracted 53,000 fans to Goodison Park for a game against local rival St Helens, which was the record crowd for a women's domestic club match for almost 100 years, right up until very, very recently. And they travelled the world. They played in France. They played in the US. They played against men's teams, and they drew crowds and raised money for charity like no tomorrow. They were so successful. Skipping that. They were so successful that the FA banned women's football in 1921, a year after the Dicko Ladies had had 53,000 at Goodison Park, citing it as being unsuitable for women to play football. Obviously, the war had ended in 1921. Women had gone back into the homes. They, needed to free up the jobs for men, and essentially push women back into the households, really. And so that meant that there was a big shift in the way that society saw women and the role of women, and that impacted the kind of effect that impacted women's football almost irrevocably. So yeah, the FA banned women's football. It was a ban that lasted 50 years, and it wasn't an out ban. They couldn't literally stop women from playing football, but they ruled that women's teams weren't allowed to play on FA affiliated grounds anymore. So, Goodison Park and all of the big men's stadiums were suddenly ruled out of action entirely. And that forced women's teams and players into parks, into athletics tracks, into rugby stadiums, anywhere that would let them play. But they were kind of grounds with significantly smaller capacities. And there was a huge sort of stepping down of crowd sizes as a result. They couldn't physically fit them there. So gradually the women's game shrunk in profile. There were teams that sort of battled on. Dicko Ladies battled on until 1965. Manchester Corinthians was a team established during the ban that played all around the world. You can see their impressive trophy cabinet. They competed in tournaments in Italy, in France, really kind of well established, one of the teams of sort of the 60s and 50s, 60s and 70s that led the way in pioneering the game at a time where they weren't allowed to play. In 1970 there was an unofficial World Cup which attracted more than 40,000 to the final. There were talks of it possibly reaching even up to 90,000, and you can see the crowds there pretty huge. The first official World Cup didn't come around until 1991, which was not even called the World Cup because FIFA didn't want to bring down the brand. It was called the first FIFA World Championship for Women's Football for the M&M's Cup, and it was won by the US Women's National Team, and they returned it very low profile. They returned to America, zero fanfare, no one waiting for them at the airport, no one knew that they had won it. One player even said on the plane, the woman next to her asked her what she'd been doing, and had no idea that there had been a Women's World Cup, that they had won anything. You fast forward 8 years and you've got the 99ers in the US who won the World Cup again, but on US soil in front of a crowd of more than 90,000 fans in Pasadena, which is where the iconic picture from my book comes from. Brandi Chastain celebrating the winning penalty against China to win that tournament. Now, it massively transformed the game in the US. It exploded it onto the center stage. Girls were playing everywhere. There was unique set of circumstances around the US that meant that Title IX, a legislation which ruled that education institutions had to fund women and men's sports equally at college level and school level, meant that you had huge investment into women's soccer and women's sports programs in the same way that they did into sort of American football and baseball and things like that, and a very unique set of circumstances in that it was also not a big men's sport in the US too. But now we're seeing here a sort of similar resurgence of women's football on the scale of the 99ers as a result of the Euros. The England women's national team winning the Euros has changed the game forever. I burst into tears at the final because I've followed the women's football since I was quite young, and had covered many of those players for a number of years, and really watched how hard they had fought to get to that position. So many of them started as amateurs, working a number of jobs. I remember Jill Scott talking about training in a prison gym up in the northeast, because they had the best gym facilities at the time in the sort of like early 90s. And that was sort of the level that they had started at. So to see them reach this sort of pinnacle of the game in 2022 was particularly special. But that wasn't a victory that was a surprise in many respects, because it had very much been built for. The FA had in 2017 launched a strategy for the women's game that included targeting success at the Euros in 2021, which became 2022 as the pandemic pushed the tournament back, and at the World Cup this year in Australia and New Zealand. And they've already met one of those targets by winning the Euros. So it was very much a plan, a structured approach to build and put the support structure around the team and the facilities and the resources into the team that would enable them to reach success. And that's in many ways why the Euros win is about so much more than a team winning a football tournament, because that team showed that if you invest in women and support them and back them properly, they can achieve great things. And that sends a much wider message to women and girls in many, many other areas about the importance of feeling valued and of being supported, but also to businesses generally, to sports generally, that if you invest in women, it pays off. It's not money thrown into the dark, and it's empowered a lot of those players to speak out very strongly on issues that matter to them, like the right of girls to be able to play football and benefit from a lot of the life skills that it's given them. I remember one player very recently saying to me, I want a girl to be able to choose not to play football, because that means they had the choice in the first place. And I think that really speaks to the legacy of this team and what they were able to achieve. And that's a real sort of like game-changing moment that is going to enable a huge number of girls to be able to look at sport and feel like they belong in it and have a place, and can be strong and powerful and physical and athletic in a way that bucks the trend and the way society says they should be. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Suzanne, and what a lovely optimistic note to end things on. Thank you to all of our brilliant speakers this evening, Dean, Patrick, Kirsty, Thomas, and Suzanne, for such an insightful and compelling evening. Details about all of their books are posted in the chat, so do check those out. In 2 weeks' time, we have the Water Panel, the next in our Earth Convention series with Rathbones, featuring Adam Nicholson, Alok Jar, Doreen Cunningham, and Tobias Jones. It's not to be missed, and you can register for that via our website. Thank you all again, and good night.